Well, good evening. I'd like to call to order the joint virtual study session of the Littleton Planning Commission and the Historic Preservation Board for Monday, May 11th, 2020. Do we need a roll call or not?
We do not.
Okay. So Colleen, if you will review the process for the virtual meeting.
Thank you, Chair Rudnicki. Good evening, Planning Commission and Historical Preservation Board. I am Colleen Norton, City Clerk, and this is for our citizens and anyone who may be watching. Due to COVID-19, the City of Littleton is providing virtual coverage of City Council and select boards and commissions meetings to protect the health of citizens, council members, and staff. Meetings will not be held in the community room until further notice. Options for viewing City Council and boards and commission study sessions are as follows. You can watch the live telecast on Comcast or CenturyLink Channel 8, watch live on Facebook at www.facebook.com/City of Littleton, or visit www.littletongov.org/Channel 8 to watch the live stream on the city's website.
Okay. We have three study session topics for this evening. Downtown Streetscape Design Capstone Project with the CU Denver Master of Urban and Regional Planning. I think they have some representatives here. Secondly, staff briefing on the Unified Land Use Code. That's Kathleen will take us through that. And third, we'll have a discussion on the historic character of downtown Littleton. So first item up is ID number 20-131, Downtown Streetscape Design Capstone Project. Could we have a staff presentation, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Rudnicki and members of the Planning Commission and the Historical Preservation Board. I wanted to start out, I made an error in our staff report. I misidentified the Colorado University Denver School of Architecture and Planning, and just wanted to clarify that. It is not environmental policy or anything like that. So wanted to clarify that in your staff report and turn it over to Elizabeth K. Marchetti.
If you could let us know who she is and what.
Yes, Elizabeth is our senior planner, and she's the staff coordinator for this project.
Okay.
Hi, can folks see me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Actually, Shane Roberts and I were co-managers of this effort, and he'll actually be the first one to introduce the effort, and then I'll finish up and introduce Gabby Masucci and John Rocknow.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So like Elizabeth said, I'm Shane Roberts. I'm a transportation planner with Public Works. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of this project and introduce the students. So last fall, we were seeking some funding for a downtown streetscape study, and we were unsuccessful in that, but we had an opportunity to call for projects from UC Denver's MERT program to have students come and look at the downtown streetscape. And so we submitted a little brief of what we were looking for. And John and Gabby selected, they're the two students you'll meet tonight, selected our project as the one they'd like to work on. And so just a quick overview of what we had them do. We really had to focus on Main Street and Alamo, not downtown overall. And we really wanted them to focus on looking at the space, but from building front to building front, and how they could reimagine that space to create an area that's inviting to pedestrians, as well as facilitates the business activities that go on there on a day-to-day basis. And so some of the things we asked them, or we did not ask them to focus on, were some of the larger pictures, or the bigger issues that, if this were an actual study that we would need to get down to, such things as funding, addressing larger parking needs, and then addressing some of the larger downtown transportation needs. So we really wanted them to just focus on the streetscape. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Elizabeth to give you a little bit of background on the students.
Thanks, Shane. So again, my name is Elizabeth K. Marchetti, and I'm a senior planner with the City of Littleton. Shane and I are also past graduates of the CU Denver School of Architecture and Planning with master's degrees in urban and regional planning. It has been a real pleasure to work with Gabby and John on their capstone project. This process reminded us both of how valuable the city's connections are with the institutions of higher learning in the metro region. It's a unique learning opportunity for students. It's also an opportunity for the government to contribute to the field of study and advancement of the planning profession. We think that collaborative efforts like this one, and with student interns who are temporarily employed by the city, are key components of the resiliency of this city and this region. I'm very happy to introduce Ms. Gabrielle Masucci and Mr. Jonathan Brockna, who will now present a summary of their capstone project and their recommendations.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I'm going to share my screen here. All right, it should be, there we go.
Awesome. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present to everyone in this COVID-19 world. We are students of the University of Colorado Denver's Master of Urban and Regional Planning, as Elizabeth and Shane had mentioned. My name is John Brockna. I'm originally from Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and this project was particularly of interest to me because I'm really interested in looking at urban design and transportation and how pedestrians interact within a space in a transportation setting.
And I'm Gabby Masucci. I'm originally from New Jersey, but I've been in Colorado for about 10 years. I did my undergrad at DU, and I am a second year in the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program, as well as John. We actually both graduate on Saturday, so looking forward to this opportunity before we graduate. I was really interested in this Littleton project because I've always had an interest in how people interact with their built environment, and specifically how thinking about the quantity and quality of space that's allocated to the pedestrian and how that can help to contribute to a place's identity. So the objective for this capstone program, like Elizabeth had mentioned, is to provide client-based planning experience as well as to utilize what we've learned throughout our time in the MERP program. So tonight we will go through, we will sum up our project background, the background research that we did, existing conditions, our preliminary recommendations that led to our final recommendations. So to start off with our background research or project background, as Elizabeth and Shane had introduced the project, the goal for the project was to reimagine how the streetscape could look for multiple users while also maintaining the character and the existing functions of the street and what it provides to the Main Street and Alamo Avenue. So before you on the screen are the objectives that John and I both identified for the project in sum. In order to split up the project effectively, I took on looking at Alamo Avenue while John looked at Main Street. So our design objectives were to understand the uniqueness of both streets and their importance to the downtown, propose design recommendations that were aligned with goals outlined in the Envision Littleton Comprehensive Plan, and then propose design recommendations that furthered these goals through different elements of placemaking, walkability, multimodal, and Americans with Disabilities Act considerations. Moving on to our background research.
So in order to really develop our final design recommendations, we first looked at what Littleton is as a community as a whole. And by doing this, we really looked at some of the guiding plans that make Littleton what it is today. And the plans that we really looked at were the design standards and guidelines of downtown Littleton, and how each sub area is broken up, and looked at the characteristics that make up Alamo and the characteristics that make up Main Street, which is an historic district. And then we went forward and then we looked at the comprehensive plan, which really is just a very broad overview of downtown, the city of downtown, and really emphasizes the unique character, the identity that the downtown creates Littleton. And when people think of Littleton, we really looked at the comprehensive plan as what is the character of Littleton. And then finally, we looked at the transportation master plan to really understand how the city wants to go forward in designing their streets and what they want to do with the streetscape, how the pedestrians and people in vehicles interact in downtown on Main Street and in Alamo. And the transportation master plan really had a couple of keywords that we used in our background research and our existing conditions and then our final recommendations. It talked about healthy, inclusive, prosperous, and a sustainable environment, looking at the social aspect, the environmental aspect, and then the economic aspect of where we are now and then where we will be in the future.
So moving forward into our existing conditions, one thing we first wanted to understand was who is the population that lives in Littleton, and more specifically, who lives in the downtown area. So our report goes into much greater detail on these demographics, but tonight we thought it would be pertinent to share with you some key findings on this downtown demographic. So we can see here that the majority of the downtown population is a younger age, between 25 and 34 years old. And 93% of the occupied units, residential units in downtown, are rentals. And then finally, looking at commuting to work characteristics, we found similar characteristics to the greater Littleton population, where the majority, about 68% of the downtown population, drives alone, and about 9% of the downtown population takes public transportation. So in addition to this, we also wanted to look at the RTD ridership data from 2018, specifically focusing on the downtown station. And so what we found was that between 700 and 800 people board the northbound C and D lines, and about that same number deboard at the downtown Littleton station from the southbound lines. So this just goes to show that there's a considerable number of potential pedestrians that are utilizing both Main Street and Alamo.
So in addition to the demographic data that Gabby had summarized for us, we also looked at the traffic counts, which the city had done a study in 2018, which showed the counts taken in and around Main and Alamo Avenue from north to south, and the connecting levels of volumes of traffic coming in and out. And as a transportation master plan had talked about, the downtown area, it's more looking at from a regional level instead of just the downtown area, and how traffic influences this area more from a scope of just city of Littleton, but also in the greater region of Denver. And the transportation master plan uses these streets and recommended that Main Street and Alamo Avenue are designated as mixed use areas in the downtown area. And they're characterized as wide streets with daily counts of 6,000 to 40,000, which is considerably larger than current counts are, as you can see from the graphic we have here, which are ranging from 13,000 to about 1,000. The focus of this is really to make it more of a pedestrian-oriented environment with no setbacks and street frontages that activate the ground floor uses. In addition to this, both South Rapp and South Curtis are proposed as mixed-use downtown connectors that are characterized by three characteristics: slower speeds. They'll provide local access for businesses and restaurants and retail. Similarly, the downtown streets, this will designate a projected, is higher than what was currently counted by the city in 2018. This information helped us in understanding our interaction with the downtown area and how Main Street and Alamo interact, and will help us for our final design recommendations and improvement opportunities. And then going into our existing conditions, we developed existing conditions maps that looked at parcel data's current locations, the number of parking spots, tree locations, pinch points that are created there. And we focused in on looking at the pavement type and the unevenness and where areas might be obstructing to pedestrians. And so moving in, we actually visited the site and did some site observations back in January. And as you can see here, we walked down the street and we looked at where pinch points are, and pinch points are areas where a wheelchair user or someone walking needs to maneuver around a light post, a tree, snow, because these pictures were taken about a month after the last snowfall had fallen and there's still snow present. So that could prove to be an obstacle for someone walking. in that area. In addition to this, we also looked at pedestrian safety at the crosswalks. We looked at uneven pavement and the wear and tear for a pedestrian or wheelchair user wanting to cross and less than favorable weather, how that might affect their mobility and safety with vehicles going by and other pedestrians moving around and affecting the businesses, might affect the businesses and their economic future. And then kind of more looking at a broad scope, looking at the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and constraints of Main Street. Really, the biggest strength is its historic buildings and architecture. It really creates the identity of the downtown area, and then the ground floor activation, and then tree cover. But some of the weaknesses with this is the tree realignment is uneven. And this is also creates uneven pavements with roots as the trees grow, and this creates pinch points, and then snow storage can go at lengths, and then parking is another area where we saw areas of opportunity increases of which we can increase safety and areas of opportunity for economic growth.
So similarly, moving on to the existing conditions of Alamo, we mapped the existing conditions and notable issues that we saw along the streets. This helped give a comprehensive view of where we would move forward with for our preliminary recommendations. So some notable things along Alamo is that Alamo has very consistent sidewalks, and there are only a few instances of these pinch points, but where they are is notable. And then there are a few areas of pedestrian safety concerns, like this second bottom picture is at the intersection of South Rapp and Alamo. So just as cars are leaving Santa Fe and coming on to entering Littleton through Alamo, they are driving through an area that is unmarked for pedestrians and could be potentially unsafe. And then we saw some areas where there were either missing painted crosswalks or missing ADA infrastructure, and then as well as some other pedestrian visibility concerns. So similarly, wanting to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and constraints of Alamo, an overall strength is the presence of historic buildings and the consistent sidewalks. Alamo has two very distinct characters along the street as defined by the sub areas. So the western portion is characterized by smaller scale, more residential buildings, while the eastern side of the street is characterized by larger commercial buildings. So this changes the variations of setbacks along the street. And because of this, we found a weakness as a general lack of activation, whereas on Main Street, you have the building fronting the sidewalk completely. So there's a lot of opportunity in this. Some of the opportunities seen were at the View House Restaurant Alley that also leads to the crosswalk connecting to the surface parking lot. Improvements to the streetscape that would connect both sub areas to provide a complete identity for Alamo Avenue, and then improvements for pedestrian and wheelchair accessibility and comfort. And as you'll note, I listed surface parking lots here 3 times. They are both a strength, a weakness, and an opportunity. The weakness being that multiple surface parking lots they add curb cuts into the pedestrian right-of-way. And then an opportunity here is looking forward into the future. When we think about Alamo 5-10 years from now, we can look at these as blank slates where infill development is potential and can increase activation. So moving forward, we took our existing conditions and our background research and moved into some specific preliminary recommendations that would then be presented to Elizabeth and Shane for their feedback and how we would move forward with our final design recommendations.
So going into some of the preliminary recommendations for Main Street. Main Street in itself is a beautiful street. It's when you drive in from the east, you look straight into the mountains. And when you come down, there's an area where there's pedestrian crosswalk when you come in. Really, the whole idea of these preliminary plans was how to create a safer environment for pedestrians, but still allow for automobiles to use the area to park, to drive through, because they are both major arterials, as we showed in the traffic counts from earlier. So it was really looking at the crosswalks. The preliminary recommendations was raising the crosswalks to create a physical barrier within the street, so cars would actually would notice when they're going over that. And in addition to this, trees, the second recommendation was realigning the trees closer to the street, because studies have shown that if you use trees along the street, cars will actually go slower. It acts as a natural safety net mechanism to slow down traffic. And then the second preliminary recommendation was looking at a speed hump as another physical barrier to slow down traffic and make vehicles more aware of their surroundings. And this would be located at Rio Grande and then South Rapp Street intersections.
For Alamo, I looked at 3 specific locations for design improvements. I proposed an intersection improvement at South Rapp and Alamo Avenue that would formalize a crossing area for pedestrians. This would ensure that there was a safe place for pedestrians to cross and formalize this area. The second was a view house, restaurant, alley, and crosswalk improvement. So moving the existing crosswalk a little bit farther west, along with the signage so that it would be more visible. And then finally, a temporary mid-block improvement between Curtis and Nevada. This would reallocate some parking space and use this and give this back to the pedestrian. And so the feedback received for these 3 were specific feedbacks on how to further refine these recommendations. But the general recommendation that I moved forward with for the final design was to really look at the streetscape as a whole. So how could Alamo itself be improved, and rather than these very specific locations. And so I took that feedback as we move forward with the final designs.
So moving into the final designs for Main Street, I really wanted to look at the pedestrian experience. And right now, the pedestrian, they use the entire sidewalk, and in Main Street, they're about 12 to 15 feet on average. But when they walk along, there's a lot of obstruction from trees to streetlights to signs, and you have to maneuver around them. And I had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of areas where you put snow that lasts a long time. And so the idea was to really create more of a linear unison for where the trees go, where the streetlights go, and putting the trees closer to where the cars are parked to create more of a designated area for pedestrians. And this will also create a safer environment, because cars, as studies have shown, will drive slower because trees are closer to the street. They have shown that it slows down, and it will create a space of about 10 to 11 feet where it's designated specifically for pedestrians, and wheelchair users can maneuver across the sidewalk more in a linear fashion. In addition to this, my second idea was to get rid of all the trees, simply because talking with the historic preservation, the key part of Main Street is the beautiful architecture of the building. So there's been talk of that the trees actually block the trees block the architecture. What happens if we got rid of them and instead put flower pots or some type of planters along, still acting as a barrier, but now the focus is the building infrastructure instead, and that's what creates the environment of Main Street. And then moving forward, now we're moving into the street and activating the parking spaces. If you've walked down Main Street, there are these big white X's, and they're actually a lot of space that is underutilized. There's about 5 feet by 10 feet. And I specifically looked at between South Curtis Street and South Nevada Street and found that there's 20 feet of extra space that is underutilized by just these white X's. In addition to this, if we remove 2 parking spots on either side and relocate them to the side streets, you could have 40 feet of curbside space that can be used as an area for pedestrians to really congregate at. And further studies have shown that if you create an area that is close to restaurants and businesses, people will be more willing to shop there. If you create more of a temporary, as this first design shows, by painting lines and adding in planters as barriers, as buffers, and then trash cans, and then seating areas in form of tables and chairs, it'll create a temporary area for people to use. You can create this space during festivals, summer and spring and fall months. And because of its location being Curtis in South Nevada, these people sitting here will also be more inclined to go and visit the shops, or maybe go to the restaurants or to the bars, and which will be an added benefit to the businesses around that area. And more of a long-term projection is actually filling in the area with concrete, adding in planters, benches, in a similar style as before, but now it's a permanent structure where people can sit and visit the businesses and restaurants along there. And then the final recommendation is instead of a raised crosswalk, actually raising the entire intersection. And the reason for this is it creates a connection between all the sidewalks. It's a leveled space that for people, wheelchair users, when current in our existing conditions, it showed they have to go down, they have to go up. There's cracks in the uneven pavement. And in unfavorable weather, when there's maybe ice or sleet or snow, this can prove to be difficult. But if you raise everything up to an even level, it's a lot safer for them to cross. This has also been, studies have shown that raising the intersections have proven to be safer because cars are more aware, because the speed hump is longer. And so cars have to go over, and they're more aware of pedestrians crossing the road. And so this is an opportunity to really make downtown Main Street more pedestrian friendly, but still keeping the focus on a vehicle oriented area.
So then moving on to Alamo, my focus for the final design recommendations was to really focus on maintaining the existing character of both sub areas of the street, but then figuring out a way to create and establish a sense of place, meaning providing a connection between the pedestrians or users of the street and the environment surrounding them. So this first slide shows my proposal for a consistent streetscape, one that has widens the pedestrian usable space on the north side of the street, where we see the buffer space being transformed with brick or pavers. And this would be next to the on-street parking. So here, this would be a comfortable place for people to get out of their cars and meander and also walk onto the sidewalks. Here, this provides additional space for seating opportunities like benches and other seating elements along the length of the street. And then on the south side of the street, formalizing a consistent buffer of landscaping, where right now you have some parts of this buffer zone that are either landscaped with grass, or some just are filled in with rock. So the idea would be to create a consistent streetscape that runs the length of Alamo, connecting these two distinct areas of character. So then I also wanted to look at a more specific recommendation, and this builds upon my recommendation for the reuse of 2 parking spaces. This is a cross-section of the mid-block between South Curtis Street and South Nevada Street. So on the left side here is an existing 2-story building that abuts the sidewalk. And this is a unique element to Alamo, and provides a lot of opportunity for activation. So like John mentioned before, there are several of these large X spots that can be repurposed and for additional parking, or in the case of this proposal, to be repurposed for on-street parking taken from elsewhere. Across the street, I am showing a existing surface parking lot. So this shows that any design recommendation won't interfere with cars that are entering onto Alamo. The proposal here is to propose design changes as seen on the right side. This would be that buffer, that landscape buffer, and then on the left, taking these 2 parking spaces that total the length of 40 feet and giving some back to the pedestrian. So here we see a short-term and low-cost solution. This would be painting these 2 parking spaces and then adding buffers with planters that would run the length of the neighboring travel lane, as well as additional planters here. And then we also see some variations of seating options. This would be a great short-term solution for how to activate and really create a space that is sticky. It encourages pedestrians to stay a little bit longer, to linger on Alamo, and to give them a little bit more of a destination here. And then what this looks like as a permanent design recommendation is to bring that same space up to grade with the sidewalk. So now you're mitigating any ADA issues here. And as you'll see on the left side, this maintains the proposed brick or paver buffer of 4 feet. So this would really be an intentional space that would be activated right in front of these 2 businesses. We can see this as a way to really create some notable areas on Alamo. And so in sum, we believe that through our existing conditions, our background research, and the feedback that we got from Elizabeth and Shane throughout this process, that these design recommendations can be taken forward and really they help to achieve some of those goals outlined in Littleton's existing plans. And if you have any questions or comments, we are willing to take them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Can you bring up the screen with everybody's pictures?
Yes.
There we go. We'll open it up for questions. Anybody want to go first? Raise your hand. Dan?
Yeah, I had a question. Well, one, thanks for your hard work. This is exciting. It's fun to see how you guys look at this through your lens, and so I appreciate that. I guess one question I had is, did you study or did you get some information from the city about the car speed between Main Street and Alamo? I mean, just intuitively, it feels like Alamo is a faster street. I mean, I kind of have maybe some reasons why, but I'm just wondering if you guys looked at that, and was there a perceived safety issue between the 2?
So I can speak to that on Alamo. That was one of the reasons why some of my design recommendations focused on that intersection at South Rap and Alamo. As you have people exiting Santa Fe and coming onto Alamo, they have a continuous path of travel without any stopping until they reach, I think, South Curtis. So that provides an area of opportunity, I would say, to improve pedestrian safety, or just safety in general, as a way to think about like how to slow down that traffic.
But it is true that Alamo traffic is probably faster than Main Street. Is that?
We didn't get a chance to look at the speed data from that. We looked at the traffic counts, so we were able to see like where we had high interactions of high traffic volume.
And Dan, this is Shane Roberts with Public Works. We have that information. I don't have it right here in my hand, but I can get that to you.
I was just curious.
Dan, you're probably right on the speeds on on Side Street, Alamo. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's just an opportunity or if that's a perception the public has that does Alamo seem faster, and does that make it feel less like a great place to hang out? I'm curious about that. I appreciate the ideas about the temporary, call them pocket parks, and those parallel spaces. Seen that happen elsewhere, and they tend to be used, and especially if they're located, near Smoking Fins or a place, eating establishment. They tend to like those. So I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. So the sidewalk width on Main Street, the way John, you were proposing it, would that, I think it was 11 feet for that pedestrian zone, would that still be adequate to have those sort of cafe fences and outdoor seating areas, or does that need to be pushed to those street spaces that you're recommending?
So ideally, there would still be space, but it would be very limited. It would create the pinch points as we were talking about before. And the idea would actually be to move to have those temporary spots, actually move the seating areas out to a spot within one of the parking spots areas. And that's why the reasoning being it could be temporary, because you could have it just from designated hours. And, you know, you're removing maybe 1 or 2 parking spaces and moving those and using wayfinding to move those to the side streets could give an opportunity, depending on the time of day or weekend or during the week days, to really give that flexibility of when you could do that. But removing those completely, it would still be a very constricting part if you were to do that design completely, so that it would push more into the street and being able to use more space that's used out there with the parking spots.
So I'm guessing if you had 2 more weeks of time, you may have looked at the alleyways between Alamo and Main Street. I know the Historic Preservation Board a number of years ago was charged to look at the alleyways and how to activate them, and we could use some advice at some point. So next time.
I think that could have been a whole project.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
The next senior crowd here from CU Denver. Who else? Raise your hand. Kimberly. Whoop.
Okay.
Thank
you. That was a great presentation. It was very thought-provoking. And I think it's interesting to think about just how difficult it is to maneuver on Main Street. We have the Colorado Center for the Blind several blocks away. And I've often watched their students try to kind of pick their way through all of the obstacles. And they're real. They're very much real. And also, I think that as you addressed maneuverability for wheelchairs, the same holds true for pushing a stroller. That would make it much easier and much more pedestrian friendly when you're pushing a child in a stroller. And that definitely opens up walkability. I was a little scared when you said eliminate the trees. We love our trees. You know, at Christmas time, the decorated trees on Main Street draws people from around the area. So I would poo-poo that idea.
Yeah.
But I thought your presentation was interesting and thought-provoking. And you're probably right about the big X's of space next to the parking spots on Main Street. But I have to say, it really makes it easy to whip into a parallel parking spot. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Who's next? Craig, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, John and Gabrielle. Nice presentation, well researched. I wondered if you considered in your analysis both Alamo and Main Street how the role of bicycles and mobility scooters in there. You talked a lot about pedestrians and parking and traffic. How would bicycles and other types of mobility fit in there?
I could speak for Maine. I guess for what I was looking at was safety, was building, using the trees, kind of creating more of a physical barrier and really adding in, slowing down the cars a little bit makes you feel safer. And if they're more aware, they're going through this very heavily trafficked area of pedestrians. And also people on scooters are coming in, people on bikes are coming in. If you have these like a raised intersection or a raised crosswalk or these trees are there, it'll create this environment that's already safer. And when you think about building infrastructure, it's not just you build everything at once, you kind of build in steps. And if you create an atmosphere that it's safer for pedestrians and it'll slow down mentally for people, vehicle operators more aware. They will also observe bikes that are on the street or a person on a scooter that's maneuvering around on maybe a sidewalk or on the street. And if a vehicle operator is more aware, they will see them more clear, and it will reduce the possibility of an accident.
So for Alamo, I considered this pretty early on and when looking at the transportation master plan. So the goals for the bike network are to have a bike lane on South Prince Street that runs through Main Street and Alamo. So looking at the broader network and then also taking into consideration how heavily used Alamo is and projected to be, along with the parking needs on that street. Given the width of that street, there wasn't a comfortable allocation of space to add its own dedicated bike lane, let alone a shared bike lane. So for that, knowing what was proposed for the surrounding area seems sufficient. Now, knowing the bike infrastructure, that is the goal for the bike infrastructure, it would then be ideal to then connect that pedestrian and bike realm by having some more bike parking facilities on Alamo so that users traveling up South Prince have a place to then park and then continue on a pedestrian travel.
So these streets are less multimodal conduits as they are destinations, I think is what you're saying.
Yes.
Which makes sense. Just a quick follow-up, because I know a lot of other folks probably have questions too, but it sounds like you considered a number of different things for these streets. Did you ever think about or talk about changing them from one-way to two-way traffic?
We discussed it, but we didn't really get into the planning phase. That could have been another project, and it was I think time was our biggest constraint, but we definitely discussed it.
That's fair enough.
I think also looking at either end of those streets, knowing the engineering that would have to go into that is a little bit beyond our scope. So we really wanted to focus on the character areas, the surrounding areas of our streetscapes and how to then work within those confines.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Andy. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This was a really interesting study that you guys did, and I appreciate all the visuals and the data, looking at all the data. I want to second the idea, just to throw it out there, that it's been proven all over the place that one-way couplets are actually not to the economic advantage of a downtown. So I'll just throw that out there, that I think it's a great idea to look at that. The cost to remedy it now will probably pay off over not too many years, I'm guessing. And then I was also interested in if you guys have seen any research lately about with coronavirus impacts and the need for people to want to have a little bit more space on sidewalks. I've heard that some communities are looking at removing a lane of on-street parking so that they can have more space for people to walk and gather in smaller groups so they're not all crammed in on the sidewalk. We're actually pretty lucky that we have decent sized sidewalks in our downtown, but now with coronavirus and people's fears, they may want to have a little more elbow room. And I've even seen some downtowns looking at completely cutting off cars altogether on the main street, making it a pedestrian mall, at least during the time that communities are struggling with the on and off, or the social distancing and all those things. Have you seen or read anything about that?
So anecdotally speaking, Denver's been going through a lot of that recently. So we have several streets that are closed to vehicles. And so Dottie's been putting out some surveys to see how people are using those and how they can be improved. And if certain streets would be preferred to be permanently closed to traffic, either completely or at certain times. I think one of the first surveys I saw was addressing the streets that go through the parks, like Cheeseman and City Park. And so I think that might be their first angle of attack for how to really give that space back to the pedestrian. And then John, I don't know if you've seen anything else related to that.
I think you covered actually a lot of it that I've seen. They're starting to come out with articles. Your question raised the idea of curbside management, and really looking at how many uses you can really use the curb and the street and everything. Even what it'll affect, like Uber and Lyft drop off and pick up, and where the seating for the restaurants will be, and how many different looking at that space and understanding that there's more than just one use, and maybe moving around depending on the time of day or the time of week and seasons is interesting. And there's a lot of studies I'm sure will be coming out with coronavirus.
Anything else? Andy? Oh, okay. All set? Rick?
Thank you.
Thanks. Rick?
Okay. We have a lot of parking and no parking signage for every parking space in downtown. Did you by chance count every one of those poles and come up with an idea how to get rid of some of those signs?
I did not, but I know that on Alamo with the recommendation to repurpose those two parking spaces elsewhere, you then create areas where you have less need for signage. If you are removing the X's and then creating longer spaces where there are parking, then you only need a few. But we did not go through a specific count of those.
I know I have counted them in the past. There's about 32 on Main Street and probably 28 on Alamo. They do take up a lot of room. They cause a lot of hazards. And I'm just wondering, some cities in Europe are just eliminating those signs because people know how to park after 100 years of driving. Could we just get by with markings on the street for the most part and eliminate a lot of vertical intrusion?
Anybody want to take up the answer to that? Doesn't look like it. Okay, I guess that's an editorial comment there, Rick. Anything else?
Signs. Yes. No, I'm good.
Okay. Who's next? Bezad?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern that I had is the ADA compliance. That's a real issue right now, is immediate hazard. And I think city has the obligation and potentially a liability. And I think the city attorney is with us and he can elaborate on that. But my question was, have you done an inventory of all the ADA non-compliance on those two streets that you guys was part of your project?
We did not do it, but the city has done an inventory so far. They're in the process of doing that, and they've identified areas that do not meet ADA compliancy or has an ADA issue, and those have been pinpointed. And there are a few on Alamo and on Main.
Excited?
I guess I would just chime in as the city attorney. Bezad, we are in the midst of preparing the ADA transition plan, something the city probably should have done many decades ago. And so a lot of these locations that don't have the ADA compliance, they are noted. We are going through, as we make improvements to certain intersections, to go about making sure that you have ramps and other ADA accessible things. So it's in the works, but it is a slow process. As you are aware, you drive around a lot of major cities or any place in Littleton, and you're certainly going to find things that probably aren't up to ADA compliance in terms of widths of sidewalks and any number of things, but especially the crossings are something that we are certainly aware of, and trying to set a plan to correct those as soon as we can.
Great, thank you.
David?
Yeah, I let me know if I'm breaking up. I can turn the video up, but I enjoyed your presentation, and I really like the idea of raising the intersection and other areas to sidewalk level. I would like to see more attention paid to bicycle traffic. Just mixing them in the street, just feels unsafe to me. I think most people aren't going to want to be. I think I've seen some plans that show, or some visualizations that show bike lanes fitting in there. And I know from some of the stuff that I've read that, as you, I think, pointed out, the narrower the streets, the slower people drive. As things are crowded in towards the street, people tend to slow down a bit, which maybe that's counterintuitive, but I think that's that's true. If you're driving through a downtown area, I've experienced this myself, where there's less room to drive, you kind of become more cautious, whether that's artificial barriers or other. To the point of redirecting traffic, I know in places like Redmond, Oregon, and Bend, Oregon, where it's downtowns have become very popular to drive through. They've actually created bypasses around downtowns. There is a potential, maybe since Main Street is such a popular shopping area, making Alamo two lanes and having that be a bypass and making it more difficult to drive through on Main Street during rush hour, at least. Just some random thoughts I had. So that's it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Bruce, is your finger up? Okay.
It is.
All right. The right one?
I
Okay.
actually thought David's point there was interesting. I was going to ask it in a different way, but essentially sort of the same question. I think Main Street is the pedestrian changes you folks are describing, I think are very interesting and well done on the presentation. It's good work and it was a good presentation. On Alamo, chicken or an egg question, which comes first, the pedestrians or some element of business, retail that attracts the pedestrians in the first place? I mean, there's, you've got a lot of stuff over there there's some residential, there's, I think, that tea house or I forget the name of it. There's the Elks Club, there's the post office, and there's the ACC building. The idea of making that a bypass is a pretty intriguing idea because to me, it seems like Main Street is the one we're focused on. I'm not sure I like your idea of the raised intersection at RAP, but I'm not sure that a lot of pedestrian activity is going to happen on Alamo because I just not entirely sure there's much need for pedestrians almost to be on that street other than if they're parking to come over to Main Street. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think on Alamo, I was really taking those considerations of what's existing today and then how that might look in the future. So like I mentioned before, there are a number of surface parking lots, which all have the opportunity to be redeveloped and infill development. So there is potential for Alamo to eventually become a more pedestrian activated street, where I propose the parklet that you have those two businesses that front the sidewalk. And last time I was in Littleton a couple months ago, I noticed that one of them, I believe, was for rent. And just from my time in Littleton, have noticed some kind of turnover in that space. So maybe having an area that encourages pedestrians to hang out and linger a little bit longer will also lead to business retention.
Okay. All right. Interesting point.
Okay.
Thank
Who's
you.
next? Laura?
Yes, thank you again for doing the presentation. I thought you all did a really good job and gave us a lot of ideas, things to think upon. But I do have a question. Both of you talked about removing 2 or 3 or 4 parking spaces and moving them to the side streets. Parking in downtown Littleton is at a premium. If you go down there and want to do anything, parking is really hard to find. So if you remove those parking spaces from Main Street and from Alamo and move them to a side street, what kind of plan do you have for that as parking already seems to be maxed out downtown?
The idea would be to control that by the idea we both represented temporary, these temporary curb extensions of pedestrian movements. So you could do a study looking at well, when is the highest amount of traffic coming in? When do people go to dinner? When do people go to lunch or breakfast? When are restaurants busiest? And so when they're not the busiest, then you can maybe change those spaces that we had recommended as areas where they could be pedestrian sitting, maybe around 10 o'clock in the morning. That's kind of in between breakfast. That's brunch hour, maybe in the afternoon. You could designate for 2 hours. Let's put out some benches. Let's put out an area for people to sit. But then when it becomes closer to dinner time, then you can remove those areas, and those parking spots become available again. So it's not really the idea of getting rid of those parking spaces. It's really the idea of using those spaces for more than just a car, more than just to park your car there and go somewhere. It's the idea that you can use those for 2 and 3 areas, and the idea that you all could, as I mentioned earlier, curbside management. You could really look at the different uses. It could be a pickup and drop off area. It could be, because not everyone's going to drive down. I know 68% are use their car in Littleton, but that area could be used for a lot of different uses.
So I would think, so I'd just like to add, for a more permanent solution, when we do talk about actually relocating those spaces, it's not a matter of removing them entirely, but one thing John and I did focus on was the amount of those X's that are in the right of way on both Main and Alamo, and that gives you back that space. It's just a matter of repainting lines to add in those like 2 that I proposed repurposing from Alamo. And so not, flooding the side streets with parking. It's really just a matter of reconfiguring what is already allotted for those same number of parking spots.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Amy.
Thank you again for the presentation. It was, as Kim said, very thought-provoking, and you got me thinking in ways I never had before. And to Rick's point, I had never really thought about all the obstacles that are there, and oh my gosh, they're everywhere. I think that the challenge in my thinking, one of the challenges, is that Main Street is trying to be so many things for so many people. It's a historic block. It's a draw for retail. It's a draw for pedestrians. It's also a major thoroughfare. And I like the fact that your presentation has kind of got us talking again about is the one-way traffic configuration really the right thing to do? And I guess I would just, it's not a question really, it's more, just kind of me thinking out loud that somehow we've got to find the right solution or the right next step that acknowledges that this is a place where there's a lot of traffic coming through in the evening at exactly the time that people are coming downtown to want to park. And so I think a lot of the solutions that we might consider wouldn't necessarily work on Main Street, because we do have to check off so many boxes here. But I loved your suggestions of the pocket parks on Alamo, for example, and the raised intersections. I think that's really good discussion points or discussion topics for us. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I'm going to chime in then. We've talked for you every time we do a downtown study or a transportation study or an area study, we talk about north-south connectors linking Main Street with Alamo and points to the south. Nothing ever seems to get done, so it's not really, we don't have the time tonight to go over a discussion of that, but it always comes up. It's always important. Nothing's ever done. So I would hope that as we get into more of the downtown look-see, we can talk more about those connectors and how to make them work well. Getting rid of trees, someone else mentioned it. That's a tar and feather bullocks offense. Don't bother trying. The trees will stay. I don't think Littleton citizens would like that at all. Just a passing thought, going out into the street with seating. I can imagine Joe Blow drinking so much on a Friday night, plowing into the seating area that projects into the street. So one has to be really careful when you're designing it to withstand some of that danger. Lastly, well, two more points. Getting rid of the parking on Main Street is a serious issue. It's going to take a lot more work. I would think that the downtown merchants would scream bloody murder. People talk about a parking problem, although downtown, within 2 or 3 blocks, you can, if you're in the know, Littleton night, you can find a place to park. It's a shorter distance than if you were at a mall trying to get in at Christmas time. Lastly, the Alamo. Alamo's a sleepy and fast street. Not much street activation, as John and Gabby you mentioned. That's, I think, going to change somewhat. We've talked in the past about bypassing Main Street, closing it down, and having two-way here or there, or looping to the north. It's a difficult problem with our football-shaped downtown as to how do you accomplish that. It's very difficult. Mm-hmm. So, any comment from you guys on what I just said?
I think I have like a comment. Was it a parking on Main Street, if you were to do it, is those white X's actually does create, if you didn't want to curb extension or any of that, you could actually do, if you add those up, I think that adds about 6 more parking spots. Mm-hmm. So there is the opportunity for increased parking if you realign the parking in downtown. So there is space available there, that there's an opportunity to add spots, which is really interesting to look at.
Okay. So, anyone else before we move on? Rick, go ahead. Rick?
Mark, you mentioned the north-south connections. Just a point of history. The first time that I was involved with a study for north-south connections from Main Street to ACC was in 1986.
Yeah, it's been talked about a lot.
It's been talked about a lot, and it's something that we're really missing in Littleton, and that's why we can't discount Alamo and that area north. There's a great potential for growth there, particularly commercially.
Yeah, and I think as the potential is realized on Alamo and points south, those connectors will become necessary, more important, and I think something will be done. Anything else before we move on? Jennifer?
Hi, I just wanted to thank both Gabby and John for the great job that they have done. This wasn't our ideal environment to be doing this project, and you guys did fantastic. And a lot of your suggestions I can see us definitely using as we move forward with things going on in downtown. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. I'm sorry that we have 2 other things on our agenda, so we have to move on, but thank you very much for all that you did with this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is this your final wrap up, or are you going to be amending your report somewhat from what you got tonight?
So we are in the midst of finalizing our report, which will be turned in to Elizabeth and Shane on Friday. Okay.
Well, you might have an appendix dealing with the north-south streets, for instance, the connectors, mostly pedestrian connections. Okay, thank you very much. Guys, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Next up, Kathleen, let me ask you a question. How long do you think your presentation is going to be? Want to take a little break here. Council does it for virtual meetings. We can too.
Let's see. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slides. So it can be, if there are no questions, that's the thing. Right?
Fat chance.
So if you can guarantee me no questions, I could probably get you done in like 10 minutes, but maybe we take the break and come back.
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute max, 4 minutes max break, and then reconvene. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming back. We're now on item number 2, which is ID number 20-130, a staff briefing on the Unified Land Use Code. So I assume, Kathleen, that is for you.
It is. Good evening, members of the Planning Commission and Historical Preservation Board. I'm Kathleen Osher, Manager of Innovation and Performance Excellence in the City Manager's Office. So I have a brief this evening on our progress with the Unified Land Use Code. So you should be able to see that now on the screen. Let's see. Doesn't want to advance for me. There we go. All right. So the big news is we're on schedule. And I think what's important to remember is that this is a process of discovery over the next 18 months. So we are on schedule and on track for an October 2021 adoption consideration for the new Unified Land Use Code. There are a few things that have changed with the process, you know, a little global pandemic, and then of course, working towards a series of studios, both 1 and 2 focused on downtown that had to become virtual. We're still trying to figure out for future studios, which are really our opportunity to kind of test some ideas and find consensus in the community on things related to our regulatory framework. But those future studios, we still are kind of working daily to understand where we'll be at further points in the summer and what's possible. And if we can move away from a virtual setting to an in-person. So that still remains to be seen. Council amended the KKC scope. I'm seeing some lines on there. Is anyone else seeing those? Sorry. We did amend the scope for Kendall Keith's collaborative to consider changes to our existing city code in a shorter time frame. So we're looking at some additional changes that are going to function essentially like a phase 2 of what the process that you just went through. So those will be amendments to the city's existing code, and they'll address some of the issues that we weren't able to address in phase 1. And we're looking at a schedule that would consider that adoption in October of this year. You know, as many of those issues that were larger, including open space, building height, massing step backs, transition zones, front setbacks, subdivision of lots and parking, all of those, you know, are very complex and of course require a community dialogue and conversation. So we were really intent on being able to have that as part of the Unified Land Use Code. So we're able to transition that to creating a second phase of amending our existing city code. Our hope with that series of amendments is that we'll also be able to incorporate in the downtown design standards as well. You know, part of our process of discovery is, and our hope is that we'll be able to get away from having separate or different regulatory documents that people would have to reference, and really having sort of that one-stop shop of what you need to know in order to be able to develop in Littleton. One of the other things that we noticed as part of the last couple of years of Envision work is that we were able to create a new project website. The good news here is that the dedicated URL, envisionlittleton.org, is still the only address that you need to know. But this does allow a little greater functionality where people can find out about the project, follow the process, have the opportunities to participate. This allows us to have a chance to post both the results and summary and analysis of previous meetings, as well as the link, now that we're virtual, to being able to watch those webinars as well. It also allows us to have an opportunity to source the comprehensive plan, the transportation master plan, and other key documents so that they're all in one place and easy to find. One of the things that will be part of this project as we move forward is that we'll be using a software that's called ENCODE. So once we're publishing a draft for the public to review of the Unified Land Use Code, which is anticipated in June of 2021, they'll be able to kind of dig in and be able to sort of place sticky notes or offer comments. So I think it'll be a much easier process to comment and sort of think through what some of the changes may be. The timeline to amend the existing city code, I would just call out a couple of key dates. So what we are looking at is phase 1 that's coming to a conclusion on Tuesday night. We're looking at the Unified Land Use Code, which again is an 18-month process. The downtown building block will run through approximately the end of July. We anticipate that we'll have a draft of those amendments to the existing city code July 1st and have about a 30-day public comment period. Part of what we'll do in this process is also have a few discussions. One is scheduled for next Tuesday with City Council. And then we're in the process of trying to figure out, if we're still in a virtual format, could we accommodate a joint study session with Planning Commission in mid-June to talk through some of those changes before and some of those concepts before we release the draft in July. So that's something that we're trying to figure out now that we're in this sort of virtual setting. But those are a couple of important and key dates. Then as you think through the process that we would go through for adopting a phase 2, we're looking at an August study session, a first reading towards the end of September, and then a council action in the timeframe of early October. Council has also made the decision to extend the moratorium, which all of this process would then allow us to get through the next 150 days or so to get through this process, have a draft for the public review, and then move into that council action. One of the things I'd like to do this evening is just kind of review what we learned in the first Envision Studio. You know, throughout the entire Envision process, getting input and stimulating the dialogue with our community about the next 20 years of the city has always been a top priority. So in spite of our current challenge to gather together in person, we learned some pretty vital input from participants on our first Envision Studio, which was held as a webinar on March 23rd. What we learned was that considering context is important. Designs that are compatible with traditional development patterns are a preference. We learned that lower intensity development is preferred. Development with more open space, especially in front, is appropriate. This may occur as a front yard, a plaza, or other landscaped area. We also learned that a pedestrian-oriented street edge is important. Storefronts that activate the street and porches that link residents to the neighborhood are a clear preference. Lower scale buildings are preferred. Larger buildings with features that reduce scale seem to be one of those things that can be acceptable. So we look forward to understanding a little bit more about that, particularly with this idea of activating the street level in the next webinar. Another clear preference was mixing old with the new. Retaining existing buildings while adding compatible new ones is important. Design standards and guidelines can address these findings. And then one of the other last things that we learned is that design standards can be developed to address many of the factors that participants found to be important in determining what's compatible. We obviously need more community feedback. to confirm agreement on specific design variables. And that'll be a key focus for the next webinar scheduled for May 18th. As you may remember from reading through that summary, again, that's available on the project website if you haven't had a chance to go through that. We are beginning to see how unification of the requirements, standards, and guidelines into a single unified set of development standards. And we're also starting to see where downtown begins to divide into 4 character areas. And that'll be something that'll be the focus of the May 18th webinar. So those 4 character areas are neighborhood, mixed use, Main Street, and transition. Oh, we went backwards. Sorry about that. Okay, so what to expect on our next Envision Studio, which hopefully most of you have already registered for that. There's an opportunity to register at envisionlittleton.org on the participate page and the schedule that you'll see on what's coming up next. So we hope that many folks can join us for that. It'll be another virtual webinar. It'll be at 4 p.m. on Monday, May 18th. So again, we'll include polling questions. I think we did learn that we really needed a choice that was, in terms of preference or appropriateness, that we really needed one that said none of the above to help some participate in that process. We'll add a Q&A through the chat that'll be moderated, and we'll have opportunities for our speakers, which will include Brett Keast and Nori Winter, to answer those questions throughout. And then we'll be adding a number of 3D visuals, but you'll see those in context. We'll actually be able to place those in downtown and kind of put them in that setting. So I think that context will be very important. I think you'll see a smaller scale of buildings than what you saw in the first webinar if you were able to join us. You'll also see a menu of building types that are scaled and placed on lots in context, so with surrounding. And I think that will really start to demonstrate that idea of character. In many cases, what was shown in the first webinar was what was allowed. So it's important to understand if the public feels existing conditions are okay, and where, middle scenarios that were part of the previous webinar received in some cases mixed reviews. So really trying to understand what greater refinement is needed. So that'll be a part of the process for May 18th. So, let's see. Something is advancing my slides faster than I want to. So next steps. Thanks for your patience with that. We have a briefing on May 19th scheduled with City Council. And so that would be a great opportunity for any of you if you're able to tune in. And then we'll have a brief recap, of course, of the webinar from the evening before. But they'll also go through a series of policy questions for discussion. I think we'll also be able to look at a 3D model that we've created of downtown for greater context. And then the briefing on the 16th is the one that I mentioned that we're hopeful that we can figure out how to make a joint session if we can accommodate that in our new virtual setting. And that'll be an analysis of both the studios and other input, and then also potentially some scenarios and project viability economic model to really craft and hone in on some of those policy questions, and so that we can get ready to have a draft for public comment. Again, that would be released on July 1st. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, bring up all the bases here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions, anyone? Raise your hand.
I love it when I answer them all before even anyone has a chance to raise their hand.
Well, I'm sorry. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, less a question than a comment, because I think you did answer my questions before I got to ask them. One is, adding that none of the above, and also putting some of the images in context, I think helps a lot, because one of my thoughts after seeing the visual preferences that were given to us in the first Envision Studio is they seem to be biased toward a higher intensity of development. And so sometimes it was choosing the lesser of two evils. So I appreciate that you're changing it up that way, put things in context a little bit.
Yeah, we definitely got that feedback. I think, you kind of have to sort of set that up so that you can get, is there a happy middle, or is it skewed more towards the smaller scale? And I think there were a few examples where it left us with some questions. So I think that's where we can help with some refinement in this next studio to kind of test some of those.
Yeah, I know Robin was a proponent of none of the above, or not having enough choices, right, Robin?
Oh,
whoop. Turn your mic on.
My concern more was that it didn't tie back to the comprehensive plan we had just done, and there was no context to it. And it seemed to ignore two very important aspects of what we had talked about.
Okay.
Who else? Kimberly.
I just have first of all, thank you, Kathleen. That was, it was very interesting that how you made sense of all of the information, the input that you received. I just had a quick question. You mentioned that the moratorium has been extended. I didn't quite see the date. When is the date that it has been extended to?
I believe that's October 19. Is that right? October 10, I'm hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone? Anyone else? Don't see any hands. Just one comment with the last virtual, what would you call it, meeting? Yeah, I mean, I know what's allowed downtown in all the areas, and it was still a shock to see 3D renderings of what is a use by right, especially shocking along Alamo. So refining that and then other means of 3D presentation is most appreciated to see what's allowed now and see what we want for the future.
Yeah, and I think this will be one step in that direction. And then when you're able to look at a couple of different scenarios, I think that just with that context, we've been able to create a 3D model of the downtown area using ArcGIS Urban as the platform to do that. So it's going to be an incredible tool moving forward for any decisions relative to downtown. And we're just trying to understand now in this more virtual setting, it is a little challenging to try and figure out how much sort of bandwidth it requires to use well in a virtual webinar setting. So we'll be grabbing some static shots from it. But I think for, as more of for future conversations, we'll be able to kind of do that both from the street level, kind of the flyover, and look at them actually placed in different areas of downtown.
Just a 3D model for the entire downtown area, the whole football?
For the entire downtown area, yeah. So we, originally when the consultants came to us, they suggested we use something like SketchUp, which is a different platform that you can do. It's obviously a static platform, but using GIS, it is very, very cutting edge. And I think, Littleton, the way that we hope that we can use this moving forward, I don't think that any other cities are really exploring that in the same way that we are right now. So I'm really excited to kind of get to that point where we can start using it to help craft conversations, but particularly for both of your the Planning Commission and the Historical Preservation Board, it's going to be an incredible tool that will not exist as part of this project, but we'll have in our toolkit for many, many years to come.
So we could plug in potential future developments next to an existing apartment building or a single family bungalow that has stood the test of time. That will be fascinating.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, even from a design standpoint, if you had a SketchUp model, for example, from a potential partner of developing, we could just plop their model right in there and take it a spin around it and kind of see what you think and how it feels, or if they maybe have 3 or 4 different choices for you of design ideas, even at that conceptual level. So it's an incredible tool that I think particularly both of your boards will be able to utilize a lot moving into the future.
Wow. Okay. Looking forward to that. Yeah. Anyone else? Seeing none. Well, thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. We'll move forward to ID number 20-134, discussion on the historic character of downtown Littleton. Staff presentation.
Okay, Tyler, can you allow me to turn on the video?
Tyler is the man behind the curtain, making this all work.
Well, I've got, looks like I've got microphone, but not video at the moment.
Maybe work, okay.
Oh, there I am. Okay, all right. Well, good evening, Planning Commission and Historical Preservation Board. I'm Andrea Mimnott. I'm a senior planner in the Community Development Department. And as Kathleen was just saying, the downtown block of the ULUC project is underway. And downtown, of course, is the city's historic commercial center. And this is a very big component, the work that we're going to do here of that, of the downtown block. You know, everyone talks about Littleton's historic character, but there's often been little discussion in Littleton about exactly what that is. So tonight we'll begin the discussion. Rick Kronenberger, HPB board member, who has lived in Littleton, I think, Rick, probably more than half your life? At least half your life? More than half?
3/4 at least.
3/4.
1981.
Okay, all right. Rick has been very interested in Littleton. Of course, he's an architect for all these years, all these decades. And so he wanted to sort of bring forth this idea of a way of beginning to talk about our historic character. And so a questionnaire was sent out last week to each of you to better understand everyone's impressions of Main Street and Alamo Avenue. So tonight, many of the results of the survey will be talked about. Everyone will have an opportunity to participate. And then following that discussion, the HPB will need just a few more minutes to discuss the next step in this process. And I'll sort of prompt a little bit of the discussion on what that will be. So looking forward to hearing this discussion, and Rick, you can take it from here.
Okay, welcome everybody. I just want to give a little background before I get into this. I came up with this concept last fall before I even applied for the historic for years, and who can define that? And my internet connection is unstable. Anyway, my wife's watching Netflix. So Andrea and I worked on these questions last fall, and I felt that after doing some research, this was one way, if we got pretty good participation by asking these questions off the cuff without anyone looking at what's going on, we would be able to identify similarities and conflicts and just perceptions and myths of what is going on downtown. And I'm very pleased with the 13 responses that we got. I know it took a long time. I had to do it twice because I lost my answers the first time on the website. But if we can go through this process, it would help perhaps define the design guidelines and really deal with the massing issues. And we can get away with micromanaging the downtown area from a preservation standpoint and look at it for more macroly. But before I begin, I just want to ask anyone what they thought about it and what they concluded about these questions. Just give me some feedback.
Anyone go ahead and just jump in.
Rick, this is Kim. I've thoroughly enjoyed doing the survey and thinking about it. I think it's going to be incredibly useful, and I'm very excited to see what we're going to do with it in the future. I think it can be very useful throughout the city for defining what, in fact, our character is. So I really appreciate your efforts, and Andrea, yours as well. Thank you.
Rick, I thought it was well done. It's a little bit like the Supreme Court definition of, I forget what it was, but I know it when I see it. And
pornography
versus
pornography.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. But I mean, this forces us to put boundaries on things that are, personal perceptions of a common space. And I think in doing so, we end up with some commonality of language that we can talk about these things. Otherwise, we're just, I view it one way, Mark views it another way, you view it another way, Kimberly, so forth and so on. And taking this step to get us to think it through and put it on paper, I think is extraordinarily valuable in that context.
Okay. It's not going to be easy doing this, but
no.
Anything else?
Sorry. Well, I thought it was real thought-provoking. Took quite a while to fill out. It made me realize the amount of historic structures on Main Street is actually fairly limited. And I had to do a count of the number of buildings that are still intact and never been touched. I don't think there's any. They've all been remodeled, added on to this and that over the years. So there's a lot of structures from very different eras, and they all seem to generally come together downtown in a reasonable way. So it really was like I say, a thought-provoking exercise. Anyone else before Rick goes on, or is that it, Rick, for you?
Well, I was going to say, I've done historic walking tours for a number of years downtown, and so it was fun to do that survey. So I'm looking forward to seeing how you're going to organize us, because there are some wonderful buildings down there, and the sense of place of Main Street is great. And I'm sure Mark and I have been kind of going back and forth. What's next for Alamo? So I'll be curious to see what that discussion's all about.
Okay.
Anybody else? Yeah. Well, one last comment from me. It'll be interesting to see how are you going to put out the raw data. You're just going to throw it out and publish all of the responses to every question, which would be really interesting to look at.
I think we can do that. You're going to see some of the responses tonight, and we just have to talk about where we go, because there's pages. You can imagine how many comments I had to copy over. It's been about 10 hours the last 2 days. I synthesizing all this into one document.
Well, when we looked at the Santa Fe and Mineral Station area there, transportation-wise, development-wise, there was 100 pages, 120 pages of public input, and it was just page after page. So this doesn't compare, but so put it, if you would, put it out so we can all see. I'm quite curious.
Maybe more intellectually challenging, though. Okay.
Yeah. You say you had, 3 examples you wanted to go through?
Yes, I have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Okay, so here's my first response when I read everybody's questions. I'm not going to go over any summaries. I'm just going to present the data tonight. But two things came up. One was the use of the word character. This exercise is supposed to determine character, but a lot of people were saying that we had character. But how do you have a character if you can't define it? And that's one thing that we have to work on right now, is actually determine those elements, those physical elements that will determine the character of our downtown. The other phrase that was brought up a lot was the use of a small town feeling. We've been talking about the small town feeling for decades in Littleton. No one really knows what it is. It is a feel, like Bruce said, but the comprehensive plan defines what everybody feels a small town feel is. And I won't read them all, but you can see up there what the definitions are. Small town feeling does not lead to a character. It's a feeling. Character can be many different things, and you can create the same feeling. And a small town is not unique to Littleton. Any community, no matter how small or large, such as New York City, can have a small town feel based on the comprehensive plan definitions. Okay. Oh, let me go back. I'm moving my picture around. Okay, this is the first question. So what I'm going to do is go through 3 questions and show what all the comments were, so you can see how everybody responded to the question. So I won't read them all. I'll give you a minute to just scan through what all the responses were. But the first question, of course, was describe the time period of the buildings on Main Street. These are the answers I got from the 13 respondents to this. As you can see, it varies quite a bit. And one of my goals or observations of what this would do is would show how much we do know or do not really know about downtown, just based on our living in the community, what we've studied, and just our perceptions. And you can see it just varies. It's pretty close, but it varies all over the place. However, I did go back and I did calculate all the buildings. And this is from the 1997 report. I also added and subtracted the buildings that were removed. But as you can see, about 24% of the buildings were built before 1990. Another 28% built between 1990 and 1919. And then another 28% up to 45. That is 37 of the 46 buildings that are on Main Street. It has a tremendous amount of historic character. If you add in the postmodern buildings, it gets even higher.
Rick, you're counting the just the number of buildings, but the more current buildings are much larger, take up more footprint. You might want to do another analysis of, let's say volume of pre-1900 or volume of 210 to 220.
Well,
numbers would be different.
I just looked at this. This is the footprint, and it shows the size of all the buildings on Main Street. It's in the report. I think the models that Kathleen will show us, but the new buildings aren't as big as you think they are necessarily. I mean, they look bigger because they're out of scale. But you have to kind of decide whether they really fit into the character or not.
Okay.
The next question on Main Street was what viewpoint best describes how you look at Main Street? These are all the answers that everybody gave. As you can see, it's all over the board. And so what we're going to have to do is validate all this and determine what's really happening and what's not, in order to determine the character of the street. And this is everybody's perceptions. There's nothing right, there's nothing wrong about it. It's just the way we look at it. And if we can get rid of if we can get it boiled down to a couple sentence or a paragraph description, we will be able to perhaps look at preserving downtown from a higher level rather than focusing on small details. Every question had this many comments on it. So if anybody has any comments on all this, you can go ahead and let me know. But you can see how we all looked at it.
Well, I just like to comment on the variety of it. It's really telling of how each one of us perceives downtown differently.
I mean, it's something that happens all the time. And one thing that amazes me of 38 years of walking around downtown constantly is I have a perception, I go down and look at it, it's different. And I think that's true for everybody.
Well, there's the old saying that perception is reality. So my perception of downtown could be completely different from Joe Blow's, and we're both right.
And it makes it really hard to determine how a building fits into that. So we need one reality, and which I think we can get to make this work. The next one that I selected of the 13 questions on each was the physical and visual elements that distract the streetscape. And of those who took the test, this wasn't, or not the test, filled out the questionnaire. This was not about historic preservation. This was about perceptions of downtown. Historic preservation is only part of the big scheme of things. And as the Envision report discusses, and as we all talk, it's really how we feel the downtown looks as from a pedestrian standpoint, and how it feels as far as a comfortable space, a nice place to be, activities, identity, and all that. So these were all the elements that distracted from the streetscape. Some of them we heard in the earlier presentation from Capstone. And these are people's opinions as well. So what we have to do is go through and consolidate this and get rid of the opinions and myth and just get down to fact. This is one I wanted to put in because it was very enlightening. How many new buildings have been constructed and how many buildings have been rehabilitated with additions in the past 30 years? And I've been watching this for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, one of the first studies I was involved with was around 1986 and how to start dealing with downtown Littleton. It took another 13 years to get a National Register district. So the answers that everybody responded to are right here. This is what people basically said in terms of new buildings, rehabilitated. We had up to 25% were new buildings, 10 to 15 new buildings, only one new building, 75 remodeled. So basically, I've been watching downtown for a long time. There's only been 4 new buildings constructed on Main Street in the last 30 years. That's the most recent Littleton mixed use, the Tavern, and depending upon how you want to count the Main Street apartments, is 1 building or 2 buildings because it's split in the middle with the old Gritzinger photograph studio. The only new buildings, people think there's a lot of new buildings going in. There's only basically 3. Granted, one of them takes up a whole block, the Main Street apartments. And I think if we all had our say, we probably would wish that one would go away. As far as rehabilitated buildings with second stories, we only have 4 buildings that have second story additions put on it. The Red Comet building, which was the first Tax Act project in Littleton in the late 1980s. The View House, Ruth Graham's building, which is the old Lemke Market, and then Merle's, which is Adelina's restaurant, has second stories. So only 4 buildings on Main Street have had second stories added. I went through in my mind to see how many buildings have not been rehabilitated, because as we all mentioned, most of them have. I can only identify 4 buildings that have not had any work done on them. One is Details, which is at 2359. It's next to McKinner's. Grissinger's, which is the wedding dress store across the street. The whole one block on the southwest end of Main Street from Curtis going, where the dance studio is. Probably the most unattractive buildings out of all downtown, right? And then Bradford Auto Body. Those are the only ones that I could think of right now that have not had some sort of rehabilitation. And most of this rehabilitation has occurred in the last several years. And a lot of that rehabilitation has eliminated the history of these buildings. It's retained this fabric, but because of the way we allow materials to change, such as going to extruded metal window doors and frames, when you put an extruded metal window door and frame in place of a wood door and frame, which is allowed by preservation standards, you create a more modern building, not a historic building. So you only have basically the shell. And those are things that we have to look at. Those of us who look at it very closely will see it. The general public tends to not see the stuff as much. Going to Alamo Street, I'll do the same question, same 3 questions. So you can see how Alamo Street was described by everybody. If there's one street in Littleton that probably represents old Littleton and has not changed much in 80 years, it would be Alamo Street. When you enter Littleton from the west, if it's the very first time you are coming into Littleton and you drive across Santa Fe and you look at the J.D. Hill building on the corner and turn down Alamo, you could feel like you were driving down that street 80 years ago. You can see the variety of comments that we have to consolidate and work out. And there'll be a lot of discussion on this as well. But here is the construction dates on Alamo. There's 19 buildings, and 15 of them are pre-1945. There is more integrity on that street than almost anywhere else in Littleton. And if you go to the mid-century modern, it adds 2 more as well. And as we know, they are the residential houses. But what's nice about Alamo Street, which is typical of many small towns, you have the main historic district, then or the main street, which is a business street. Then usually a street on one side or the other is going to be a transition zone between residential and commercial and industrial as people moved off that main commercial street. I think that this is what happened with Alamo in Littleton in its history. Here's how we describe the historic character of Alamo. And Alamo is harder because no one's ever really looked at it. But a lot of different words used to describe Alamo compared to Main Street. And you can see the one question here really expresses the town's character, right? But we have to define what that town's character is. We could say it's this broad stuff here, but we have to define what those buildings really are. In the corner of Rapp Street and Alamo is probably the most original area of the city as you're entering from the west. We heard about some of the physical and digital elements that distract from the streetscape. And here's the ones that everybody talked about as well. And the speed of cars came up in other questions. And I mean, everything that was discussed earlier by Capstone. Alamo's a little harder street to get a handle on because of the large variety of architecture that's on the street. And then on this one, how many buildings have been constructed and rehabilitated in 30 years? There's been no new construction. The last building built was ACC, and that's just over 30 years ago. One house at 2626 South Alamo, which is right next to the parking lot by across the street from the Elks, was severely altered about 15 years ago and lost its historic significance, which is really too bad. I think 75% of the buildings rehabilitated is probably a little high, but there's been work done on a lot of them. Many of the buildings haven't changed much in 30 years, like the law offices and the yellow building. I know the Barrister building was restored recently. The little church building it looks like a church that has the Gothic arches. Those Gothic arches are not, over the front windows, are not original. They were put in to solve a structural problem, not to fix a bad design. And that was done about 16 years ago. So you can see we have to look at these buildings a little bit more, but we have a good handle on them. So on the next steps of what we have to do here is, first we have to just do an on-site verification of both streets, looking at all these comments and get a consensus on which ones really apply to that street. Once we do that, we'll start developing the specifics on what the character is of those streets. After that, we have to synthesize these questions into statements. And the way I see this going, and this is open to a lot of discussion, but I see if we can synthesize these questions into statements, they may be able to be applied to the downtown design standards and set a very high level approach to how we would do massing, infill buildings and everything else, while also addressing the pedestrian access and the pedestrian visual importance of the streets, which is what's really most critical about saving the downtown area, is how it feels from a pedestrian standpoint. So the next steps is something that the preservation board will have to talk about how we do it. I would like to have at least a couple people from the planning commission participate in this as well, since we had a lot of good comments from a few people from the planning commission, especially all the architects. I could tell who all the architects were. So
we hit it very, yeah.
yeah, I know. Okay, let me get. All right, so that's what I had right now. You can see what went into this. We have a ways to go. Any comments?
It's really
feedback?
Good summary, Rick. I mean, it's a lot of good data, and there's a lot of food for thought.
Yep.
I think it's well done.
Thanks, Bruce.
Jason, go ahead, Jason.
Do you recognize that book?
What, the pattern?
Pattern language, Christopher.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan.
So that's what we're establishing.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
I think Dan just volunteered.
I'd like to get a copy of that, but it's out of print, isn't it? It's also very expensive.
I can make you a copy.
Oh yeah. No, I first saw that book in architecture school in 1976.
And I saw it earlier
yeah, you're older, Mark.
Yeah, 68, 69 or whatever.
But Dan's right. He shows that book. And for those who don't know, it's all about the pattern language, really, is what it's all about. So
it's coming to an agreement about, or like as Bruce said, it's a shared language of different patterns that exist, and it's just kind of teasing them out and coming up with a common language.
If we can do that, then it'll make redevelopment downtown a lot easier, or let's say less painful. But we still have to identify what are the other most significant historic buildings and get those on the table immediately.
Anyone else? Jason?
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you for all the effort you put into the survey questions. They really inspired a lot of thoughts about downtown. And, I will say I learned something tonight. I tend to experience the Littleton apartments there east of Prince on the south side at the street level. And honestly, it never occurred to me that the bridal shop was a separate building because the pedestrian experience of that building, I think with the brick, is relatively successful. You get to the upper floors, I just looked at it in Google Street View, not so much. They did some things right.
I have to tell you,
brick,
Jason,
too.
when that building went in, I was asked to look at the drawings. I provided a page and a half of comments on how to change the facade. They took every single one. So you can imagine what that building would have looked like. Okay.
Yeah, you should have had 3 pages, Rick, but
yeah, I found my notes here. I have them. But yeah, that building probably was a desperation for Littleton in the late 1990s because there'd been no development and we've been in recession for so long. We took whatever we could get, and I think the only good thing about it is it's a steel frame. We could strip it out and redo the facade.
anyone else? Comments? Okay. Oh, Kimberly, I think you were raising your hand.
Yeah, that was even more fascinating than I thought it was going to be. I mean, there are a lot of surprises in there, and I can't wait to really dig into it and use it as a tool going forward. I have one suggestion, and I'd like to refer to the buildings in a more current context. I don't know what Ruth Graham's or I don't know where the Red Comet is. So, I would appreciate it if we could try to have some identifiers that folks might recognize.
Yeah, we can decide whether we want to use a historic name or a current name. So the Red Comet building is Littletown. Ruth Graham, she's the physical massage therapist right downtown.
So that's ancient arts, right?
Ancient arts. Used to be 2 Potters. It was originally Lemke's Meat Market.
Well, you could say, livery stable, southwest side. Nobody would know where that is, and that's the savory spice shop. Right. Yeah, I think we need more.
Van Tex, yeah.
Yeah, we need more addresses and less names.
Yes, that's something we have to work out because the current names change a lot. So we have to come up with some methodology how to define these buildings. I think using historic names is a good way to maintain the historic character, but we have to really memorize what all these buildings are. And most of the historic building owners are gone now, and those uses are gone, and they've all disappeared within the last 20 years or so. Like Vito's Shoe Shop, if anybody remembered that. Of course, Velour Hardware Store, which is McKinner's. So anyway, we have a ways to go. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time since I was on the board the first time. So it'll be an interesting exercise as we move forward.
Okay. Put out the raw data, please. Want to see all the comments, if you would. Okay.
I'll send them to Andrea, and she can send them out.
She can do all the input and spelling corrections and put it out. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And we do need to do a few more things here before we end this item. And that is to talk about how we're going to put together these committees, because I think we'd like to start sooner rather than later, because it relates so much to the downtown block that's going on now in the larger picture of downtown planning. And so I think if there are any volunteers, we can only have a maximum of up to 2 board members at a time. And we talked about, these committees as being kind of short-lived. This will be one of those short-lived committees. And work together with me to come up with some statements about associated with the questions that were on the questionnaire, so we can begin to come to some agreed upon statements about what downtown really is, to start to get to that character. So we don't need a vote or anything like that, just looking for volunteers.
Think about who might want to consolidate that in the beginning, and then we have to walk both streets to validate what the comments were before we do this, the final statements. So within the next week or two, Andrea will have to figure it out. We'll have to have Kim and I talk. It's probably going to just be a public meeting. We'll publish it, but we'll have to walk as a group down both streets and sort out the truths and myths and realities, and then whatever else we spot when we're going to be going and looking in person, we're going to see more things. So
yeah, but we're still working out how that public meeting can occur. It may be that it could be a group, or it may not be. We may need to go into small groups one after the next, but you'll hear from me soon on that.
Yeah.
When you're talking about groups, are you talking about everybody or just these subcommittees going around?
Everyone.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to throw in on that. Rick and I did talk about it. We were thinking that perhaps we could structure it as a study session. And it would have to be posted. The public would certainly be welcome to tag along. I think they'd find it interesting as well. But as a study session, there isn't public comment accommodated during the session itself. So if that's possible to do, to just, given the time it takes to post it, and then to approach it like that. And because it's outdoors, I think that there's, we'll be covered as far as social distancing. And, perhaps we can go from there. I think doing it as a group would be much more useful than doing it as little groups of two, because as a group, we can talk as we do the study session tour.
And it's important to talk this out. We have a lot of different opinions, so we have to come to a consensus. You can only do it by talking. And discussions of what's really there and what's not there will be important at the time. So it's a lot more work, but if we can pull this off and define the character for once downtown and get into design guidelines, it should make moving forward with the downtown redevelopment much easier, because the expectations will be set in terms of the desired outcome, but not necessarily what it will look like on a small scale.
Having joined a Cronenberger tour of Littleton Boulevard, West End, and looking at mid-century buildings, it was a jaw-dropping. It was amazing. I learned so much, driven that street a few thousand times like everybody else in this group, and I learned so much more getting Rick's perspective and just getting your nose right up against the facade and looking at the detailing. It was learned a hell of a lot. So it's
Mark, there is a document from United States Department of Interior, National Park Service. I think was published or compiled in 1998, if I remember correctly. And attached to that, there's a various National Register of Historical Places sheets. And I think maybe that's a good document to have in a website for public to review that, because it's a good history of each block by block, each building by building, and when they built, what was their function. And also there are maps there that shows the addresses, the old ones, what their name was and so forth. So I think this is a very good document to maybe just post it in a website as in conjunction with the questionnaire.
Okay.
And if you need a copy, I have a copy because I used to do a lot of work in Littleton, and actually I reviewed this many times. So
We have it. We have it at the city office. Thank you.
okay.
Thank you for the suggestion.
Any other comments for Rick and Andrea?
Yeah, well, we are looking for those volunteers for the first committee.
Do you want them now?
Yep.
I saw Dan jumping up and down.
And Chris has her hand up.
Who
So,
else? Oh, sorry.
being new to the West Side, having grown up in Aurora, I would love to be on this because I think this would be a good way to just immerse myself in what's downtown. I've been reading the survey reports that Tom and Lori Simmons have done. And so to connect those two, I think would be really helpful for me. So I would love to volunteer.
Okay, great. All right.
Who else on the planning commission wants to have a go? Stan? Who else? Robin's always accused me of being a control freak, which I argued about, but then I realized she was correct. So,
well, I think two is all we need because because of sunshine laws. So if it's just 2 board members, then we can have some freedom to meet and talk.
Okay, we have 1 planning commissioner that's volunteered. Do we have another one? Uh-oh.
I think there's several steps to this. The first one is actually walking around downtown and looking at the buildings. And I think that's the one where most people have to participate, because if you don't do that, your myths and perceptions are going to stay and they won't be corrected. You're not going to, you won't change how you see the downtown by reading something. And if it's going to be a document that we can sell to the public, we need more people to participate in it that's serving on the boards to add validity to the to what's going on. I can certainly write it all myself, but I've written a lot of things myself in Littleton for the last 40 years. We need to have a broader participation by people.
Having disagreed with Rick on a number of occasions, yes, he needs help. He needs guidance. Do we have another planning commissioner? I'll ask again. Wants to volunteer? Are you pointing to Craig?
No, that's you.
Oh, well, on my screen, it's Craig.
Oh.
He's hiding a little bit, but okay.
Chairman Rudnicki?
Okay, well, I'll volunteer if nobody else wants to. You really want
Chairman Rudnicki?
Yes.
We could potentially have 2 members from each board.
Right.
Okay.
That's what I thought you were talking about.
Yeah.
Right. I would just.
Kim?
Go ahead.
So you have 4 people on that committee? Is that what I'm hearing?
Kim, can we wait a minute? I think Reed's trying to pop in and say something.
No, I mean, if this is what we want to do, then it's going to have to be like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. So 2 from planning, 2 from HPB. That way, if we have more than that, it's going to be a violation of the open meetings law. And it's more challenging to make that open to the public when we have people with mobility issues that may not be able to attend, or we're not recording it for minutes. So I would prefer, if that's what we're going to do, that we limit it to 2 by 2 from each board. So a total of 4. And you'd have to do multiple walking tours. So Mr. Kronenberger is going to get his exercise maybe.
Well, we can get it to all work out. The most important thing on this is there's conflicting statements, and we have to work out those conflicting statements between people as well. So, but it's been a long night. I think everybody could think about this. I'll be talking with Andrea, and we'll move forward. We will share all the responses with everybody, or at least I'll give them to Andrea. She can decide. Once you read all the responses, it might not seem as daunting as you think it is.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Andrea. Any other comments before we adjourn? Staff? Jennifer, anything to add?
For me.
Jennifer's taking a break. Okay. Well, I just asked, just would ask that staff put out all the PowerPoint presentations that we looked at tonight, so we can see them down the road, especially the slides with the various comments and this and that. And then just want to thank staff for a very good virtual meeting. It was. It's actually, this is our third one on Planning Commission, and they're turning out quite well. We're learning a lot, and they're smooth, efficient, and we might get used to this and never meet again in person.
Hey, Mark, it's Jennifer. I'm sorry. I was having an issue with my audio. I just wanted to remind everyone about the studio next Monday, so please attend virtually. Feel free to bring a beverage of your choice to it. And thank you for your time. And I know HPV, this is not your typical meeting night, so I really appreciate you joining Planning Commission on this night and doing this jointly. And we will try to do more of these as we move forward with this ULUC. But we will definitely be sharing the outcomes of the survey that was put together. I think it is very eye-opening, and I'm hoping to have a platform that we can actually share it with council as well, as I think that would be very eye-opening for them.
Yeah.
So.
The webinar number 2 next Monday is 4 to 6, is that correct?
Yes. So we switched the time around to just accommodate different schedules. We got some feedback that people would like it at different times. So we're going to try the 4 o'clock time slot and see how that goes. And hopefully we stay away from bedtimes and evening craziness. So we'll give it a shot and see what our participation is.
Okay. Thank you. With that, any other comments? Seeing no hands up, eager to talk, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.